So, as you can probably tell, I've read quite a few books on happiness, psychology, spirituality, etc. over the last few years. But this book today I'm excited to talk to you about. It's Buddha's Brain by Dr. Rick Hanson. It's all about the practical neuroscience of happiness, love, and wisdom. I think you're going to like it. So let's get started. In this video, we're going to talk about Buddha's Brain, the practical neuroscience of happiness, love, and wisdom by Dr. Rick Hanson. And so we'll go through kind of basically section by section. They're kind of like five, big pieces where you start with the idea of the self-transforming brain. And we talk about suffering and how to overcome suffering, of course. And then we kind of get into like what we maybe think of like the pillars of the good life or well-being: happiness, love, and wisdom. So let's get started and stick around to the end because there's kind of an interesting ending to the book that involves like supplementation for your neurochemistry that I thought was interesting. But you should get a pretty practical overview of the book and the implications for your happiness and health. So let's get started. So like kind of the core idea of this, I would say, is it's drawing on this emerging field of contemplative science, which is the intersection of like Western science, psychology, neurology, neuroscience, and traditionally more like Eastern contemplative, philosophical, and religious traditions, right? What comes to mind when you think of like a monk or something like that. And so this book really reconciles those two perspectives into a modern synthesis, which essentially suggests that we can all learn to be happier. And through kind of practices that are grounded in both psychology and some of those contemplative traditions, we can really like train ourselves, right? Just like the body responds to physical training, you can build stronger muscles, better cardiovascular system, different physical skill sets. The brain and mind operate along similar lines. So that's the big idea. Now, that's where they start off the book. So part one is on the self-transforming brain. And Dr. Hanson explains that when your mind changes, your brain actually changes too. So there's this saying from Donald Hebb: when neurons fire together, they wire together. And so mental activity actually creates new neural structures. I think there's two examples. One of these they covered in the book with the taxi cab drivers. The other I just know from personal study that it's fascinating. So they looked at like the brains of taxi cab drivers in London, and they found that the areas of their brains associated with like spatial recognition and navigation in that domain were larger and had greater activation and density than those of normal people. And when the taxi cab drivers retired, their brains went back to normal. The piano study was done at Harvard University. They asked a group of people to basically practice playing the piano every day for several weeks. And interesting, but maybe not super surprising, that the areas of their brain associated with the piano playing muscles and those fine motor skills had greater activation and density, and they could see the changes when they looked at their brains. But they had another group of people that just visualized playing the piano for that same amount of time every day, and they had almost just as much change in their physical brain as the group that actually played the piano. So this speaks to the power of thought alone to change the brain. So what you do and what you experience shapes your brain, and thus you can use your mind to change your brain for the better. As I said, this book kind of unifies neuroscience and contemplative wisdom. Now, remember, a contemplative here referring to someone who has trained these skills, right? Like, because these qualities are these skills of happiness, of joyfulness, of loving kindness, of wisdom, of insight, of clarity, right? These are all like capacities that you can train. And so you have these traditions of oftentimes monks or monastics, but also in like the Christian tradition, they have these types of people too that have developed these contemplative practices. Then you also have modern neuroscience, and at that intersection, again, we have this idea that we can intentionally cultivate these qualities that we all want that help us to be better people, more effective people, but ultimately happier people. Final important note here is that much of what shapes our minds remains forever unconscious. So you have implicit memory, which includes our expectations, our models of relationships, emotional tendencies, and general outlook. I'll quote the book here, implicit memory establishes the interior landscape of your mind, what it feels like to be you based on the slowly accumulating residues of lived experience. It is through intentionally transforming the mind then and building up this new implicit memory and this new kind of conditioning that we can show up in a different way for our life. So that is part one, the self-transforming brain. So part two, or section two, I should say, really looks at like the causes of suffering. Now, I thought this was like a really interesting shift in perspective to think that in a sense, we are basically evolved to suffer, right? Evolution and natural selection like wants us to suffer in order to keep us alive. And it starts with this. So there are three primary strategies when we look at evolutionary biology for survival. Number one is the mind creates separations in order to form boundaries between self and the world. Number two, we maintain stability to keep mental physical systems in equilibrium. And number three, we approach opportunities and avoid threats. So looking back at that, right, you can probably kind of see these coming up in your daily life that, it's helpful to think, well, I have myself and I have the world out there. And then I have like my family and then I have the world out there. And then I have my friends. And so we're constantly dividing up and organizing information into various concepts and mental models. We try to keep physical and mental stability, right? If I am getting cold, I put on a warm jacket. If I'm getting hot, I take something off. If I'm getting hungry, I eat something. If I have to go to the bathroom, I have to eat something, right? All of those things are balancing kind of our inner conditions. And then finally, as we all know, right, we have things that we desire and we want more of, and then we have things we don't like and we want to avoid. Now, the problem is these things often lead to suffering because when something's off with them, there's like pain associated with it. But here's the thing. Everything is connected. So how are we going to create these separations and form boundaries? Okay, there's disconnect number one. Number two, everything keeps changing. So that idea of maintaining that equilibrium is also a challenge. And then number three, of course, we can't get everything we want, and we sometimes can't avoid the things we don't want, right? Opportunities go unfulfilled, threats are inescapable. And so you can start to see how our evolution wants us to have these boundaries between everything, to divide and organize information. We want to keep physical and mental equilibrium, and we want to get more of what we want and less of what we don't want, but that doesn't really jive with reality. And so that disconnect leads to quite often states of subtle or more pronounced suffering. And on top of this, the brain has like a built-in negativity bias. Our default mode it's called the default mode network, the DMN. It's essentially scanning our environment looking for threats. And it's sometimes called scanning and landing. So you can imagine if you were just a hunter-gatherer walking through the savannah, you might be kind of looking for food, but you're kind of just walking around looking for a snake, a spider, a lion, right? Anything that could jump out. And if you're scanning, and if you land on something like a squiggly line or a furry big cat or something, right? You land on it and you have a intense fight or flight reaction. What's more, we're more sensitive actually to negative stimuli. So our brains more readily store negative experiences, and generally negative events have a greater impact than corresponding positive events. This is sometimes called like loss aversion or the endowment effect, but you can think of it as like a couple things here. So first of all, negativity bias, right? We're more sensitive to negative stimuli. So think about your daily life, maybe look at your to-do list, right? What jumps out at you? All the things you have or all the things you need to do, right? Or if you think about what's getting your attention right now, is it this one problem at work or this one problem in your relationship, or is it all the other good things, right? It's probably that negative thing, okay? So the stimuli. Our brains more readily store negative experiences, right? If you think about some of the most emotionally powerful memories in your memory bank, a lot of them are unfortunately probably negative, maybe even traumatic. And then finally, this idea of negative versus positive events, maybe you can think about even with money. If you were to open your stock bank account tomorrow and found out that
there was, for some reason, there was an extra $200 in there, right? That's kind of odd. So maybe there was an error at your bank, or they gave you some weird bonus or something, like $200, like that's pretty good. Now imagine tomorrow you open your bank account and there was $200 less dollars. You're like, oh my God, have I been hacked? Why, how could this happen? You start freaking out. Okay, that same $200 negative as a loss is perceived more intensely than as a gain. Okay, and we see that that's true in the psychology. So we can understand, right, how we're set up in a lot of ways to suffer. And in taking a deeper look at this, most suffering can actually be understood through Dr. Rick Hanson draws on an Eastern story or an Eastern teaching from Buddhism of the first and second darts. So pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Now imagine this. Imagine you get shot with a dart, okay, in the arm, and that hurts, right? Not feeling good. And then imagine getting shot in the same exact spot with a second one. This story is meant to illustrate that as we go through life, we're going to have inevitable pain and discomfort and loss. But very often we experience second darts, which are these cascades of negative reactions through the sympathetic and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, also known as the HPA axis. Now, most of these are created by our minds. So you can think about these examples. Feeling of outrage. Why me? This is so unfair. How'd this happen to me? I'm so frustrated. I'm angry. I resent this. Maybe I feel guilty. Maybe I'm upset. Like all of those things are not the thing, right? They're reactions to the thing. Someone cuts you off in traffic and maybe for a second, because you have to slam on the brakes a little bit, there's a little bit of pain or discomfort there. Your heart skips a beat and you, whoa, that was crazy. And then what happens? Well, as your mind goes back to that, it generates more and more reactions and frustrations of why would they do that? Who do they think they are? I need to do something about this. This is BS. Right? All of that suffering was second dart. You're just shooting yourself over and over again in the same spot. So that sort of story or analogy is quite helpful as we start to think about how to mitigate suffering. And that is where Dr. Rick Hanson leaves us with. We may think of pillars of practice when we think about reducing suffering, which each one is kind of like an antidote to our natural evolution for suffering. So kind of practicing virtue, right? Having a moral compass and engaging in behaviors that are beneficial to ourselves and others, that sort of discipline in a way. That's overcoming our natural tendency to be emotional and overreact and fight or flight. Practicing mindfulness, which is attentiveness, that decreases our tendency for hypervigilance. Remember I said scanning and landing? Okay, when we're looking out there and our mind is wandering and we're trying to think of what could go wrong, right? It helps us to just be more centered, less hypervigilant, and prevent mind wandering. Our mind has a tendency to go off into the future and simulate things and go back to the past and remember things. But what we find is that when we can actually be present, I sometimes say, be where your feet are, we tend to be happier and more resourceful. And then finally, practicing wisdom. So reading books like this, right? Building your knowledge of psychology and human relationships, etc., helps us cut through kind of limiting or unhelpful beliefs. Let's move on to part 3. Now, the third section of the book, there are a few chapters within this, but it's all grouped under the section of happiness. And I summarize it as essentially saying happiness is really a matter of cultivating like emotional intelligence, which is the ability to recognize and regulate emotional states, and then intentionally cultivate a more positive bias when it comes to your perception. And that second point has to do with something we talked about earlier, that we have a negativity bias, right? Inherent in our evolution, we tend to pay more attention to what's going wrong and what could go wrong, etc. And so the positivity bias is trying to remember, though, that how we use our brain changes our brain, is trying to intentionally adopt a more optimistic or a more positive bent when it comes to interpreting the events of our lives. Okay, so that's one piece. The emotional piece really has to do with learning to have an awareness of emotions as they arise, and then actually change your emotional state intentionally. And again, when you change or regulate your emotional state, remember that's training your brain so that you are biased to spend more time in those positive states, right? So every time we reduce or eliminate a negative state and instead cultivate a more positive state, right, we're also training ourselves or conditioning ourselves to be in that way. And so there are several ways highlighted by Dr. Hanson to activate the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, which is kind of the core mechanism in the body and mind to regulate your emotional state. Here are a few tactics you can kind of write down and think of them as tools in a toolkit. Relax your facial muscles. Even as I do this on the video, I can kind of feel that. Feel tension draining out of your body and down into the earth. That is sort of a contemplative exercise. Run warm water over your hands. Use diaphragmatic breathing, right? So that's when you think about this area kind of in your stomach or abdomen, that if you take a breath in, it kind of inflates, and as you force all the air out of your center, it condenses in. Okay, so breathing into that area and really letting it inflate on the inhale and come in on the exhale, okay, can calm down. Use progressive relaxation, which is where you tense and then release and relax muscles from head to toe or from toe to head. Same thing, body scan is sending your awareness into your feet, and then you kind of can imagine moving it up so you can feel where your ankle is. Then you might be able to feel your shins, your calves, your knees, your thighs, your waist, your stomach, your chest, your back, your neck, right? That wave of just awareness, kind of moving it, scanning it up and down through the body is another good practice. Use a physiological sigh. This is one of my favorites, and you may have actually seen your dog or cat do this as they plop down on the floor and relax. They do something like... So what that is you fully inflate your lungs, and then you take a double inhale at the top. And then you slowly release at roughly a 2-to-1 ratio. And that produces an immediate calming effect in the nervous system. You can touch your lips. It's kind of a weird one, but it turns out that there's nerve endings there that create a calming response. Visualize something, obviously, that's relaxing or joyful or pleasant. And there was a final protocol that I thought was quite powerful, and you may consider trying it as you watch. This is from the HeartMath Institute. And it starts with, think of breathing in and out through your heart. Now, obviously, that is like metaphorical. You cannot breathe through your heart, but it means like resting your awareness on your heart and imagining the breath flowing in and out of the heart. Try to aim for a 1-to-1 ratio. So maybe you breathe in 3 or 4 seconds, out 3 or 4, and you can slow it down if you want. And as you do this 1-to-1 ratio in and out, breathing through the heart, try to actively generate some feelings of love and warmth in that area. Try that now. And just do that for a few minutes. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised just how much with intentional action you can shift the state that you're in. Moving on, the neuraxis has 2 hubs. Okay, so this is sort of like our nervous system brain right here. We have the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, and the amygdala. Now, here's what's interesting. The ACC is top down. So this is like deliberate reason and motivation, right? You're in control. The amygdala is bottom up. So it's like reactive and passionate. These 2 networks are kind of woven together, and so that we kind of govern our behavior and our states from that top down, right? You can control things and control your behavior versus sometimes you just have an emotional reaction, right? And these 2 things kind of interact. And this is often where we feel trade-offs or tension. If you think of like, well, my head says one thing, my heart says the other thing. Khalil Gibran has a book called The Prophet, which is a very good book. He explains it as reason and passion. These kind of 2 different forms of energy and control and states in the body. And so these can often be at odds, but ideally you will take steps to have awareness of both of them and eventually behave and let these 2 things kind of unify these 2 networks, right, as you go through life. So you have the passion and the reaction and the motion, but you also have the reason and logic and thought, and to the extent possible, reconciling those and striving to have them moving in a similar direction. A final concept that Dr. Hanson highlights when it comes to happiness is equanimity, which we often maybe don't think of as happiness because it's really about transcending what we think of as pleasure and pain, good or bad, desire and aversion. In Buddhism, he references the 8 worldly winds. That's W-I-N-D-S, winds, like the breeze. You say you have pleasure and you have pain. You have praise and you have blame. You have gain and you have loss. You have fame and you have infamy. Just like the breeze that's always coming and going. We want to kind of not attach to either of these, right? Those things that we desire and those things that we want to avoid. If you can go beyond those pairs of opposites, you transcend and you get to a state of equanimity where you can be fully engaged in life, but not be so caught in the ups and downs, the joys and loss. It's sort of that 10,000 foot perspective, and that sort of composure, peacefulness, tranquility, and equanimity is really, I think, a great definition of happiness. Section 4 is on love. And the key idea here is that we have both a natural tendency for like cooperation and love, but also for conflict and violence and aggression. And so what we want to do is nurture those qualities within us, intentionally building compassion and kindness. So this was a really interesting perspective for me to open. There's a saying that there are two wolves of the heart, one of love and one of hate, and the one that you feed is the one that grows. But the part that I thought was fascinating is that from like a biology and evolutionary psychology perspective, this is actually true. It's called multi-level selection, which means that we evolved both as individuals and as groups of individuals competing with other individuals. So it's that multi-level selection, meaning that we were selected for an evolution on one level, individual, and the second level is groups. And where that comes into play is saying that you can imagine that we're competing with other individuals, right? And so we're trying to get our family, our bloodline ahead. And so we have that one capacity, but on the other hand, we're competing as a team, right? Our tribe of 50 or 100 people is going up against our neighbors. And so on one hand, we have, because we're in that group and we're social primates, we have natural neural circuitry that is supportive of cooperation and love and connectedness. And at the very same time, we have neural circuitry associated with aggression towards the other, right? That other tribe across the river, we hate them. And so we have both, it's true from like evolutionary biology, hardwired into us, circuitry for love and connection and circuitry for kind of othering and hatefulness and aggression. And so that just helps us understand the human predicament. And as you look around in society and certainly politics, you can probably see how those two things happen. But again, the desire is to lean into practices that support the tendencies for love and connection. That takes us to a discussion of kind of empathy, compassion, and kindness. Dan Siegel, he quotes, he says that we have a need to feel felt, which I think is just such a well-written quote. Empathy is feeling something the other person is going through, and that helps to cut past that self and other, us versus them, bias wiring. To build empathy, you can do a few practices. You can ask questions about what the other person is feeling so as to try and feel it yourself. And you want to intentionally observe them. Think of like active listening, where you're really paying attention to what they say and how they express themselves. And as you do that, you're activating something called mirror neurons in yourself. And so this means, as primates, we have these neurons in our brains that when we see a certain expression of someone else, or even a certain gesture like I'm doing in the camera here, the neurons in our brain associated with those movements actually fire themselves. And so we are putting on ourselves the expressions that we see in others. And in doing that, we have a natural capacity for empathy. So sort of actively try to mirror what this person's doing. And you don't even have to really do it intentionally. If you just pay close attention to them, you ask questions and explore and try to resonate with how they're feeling, you will start to feel that yourself. And that's the foundation for empathy. Going one step beyond that, we can think of compassion and kindness. So compassion, we can think of as, I do not want others to suffer, whereas kindness is, I want them to be happy. And so you may focus on developing some practices in your daily life. They can be informal as you interact with other people, or formal in your meditation, trying to feel into some compassion for people who are suffering, and then trying to wish other people well. Okay, you can start with one person, a group of people, a person who's homeless on the sidewalk, whatever it is. You're trying to hit both those modes, right? You observe or have an awareness of the suffering of others and your own suffering, and you wish it to be otherwise, compassion. And you want others to flourish and be happy, and you want the same for yourself, and that's the kindness. The final pillar here is wisdom. Now, this section begins with a discussion of mindfulness. And remember, the foundation for wisdom is mindfulness, because what flows through your awareness shapes your brain, right? That was like the very first thing we talked about when we had this discussion of neuroplasticity and the self-transforming brain. And so controlling your attention is very important. And it turns out, just like any other mental or physical ability, you can train it. And that's what mindfulness practice is. On my channel, I have a ton of videos. I even wrote a book, How to Stick to Meditation, which is all about how to practice this stuff. But really what you can think of as meditation is you're trying to pay attention to your breathing, your body, some object in the present moment. And every time your mind wanders off, which it will, if you're one of these people who thinks you can't meditate because your mind's always wandering, it's like, no, that's called being a human. So every time your mind wanders and you redirect your attention, you recenter your attention, that is almost like one repetition, right? You just regulated your attention. So you've built your capacity for mindfulness, which is the ability to be where your feet are, to pay attention to the present moment. And so the foundation really for like insight and for wisdom is building this capacity to not be always caught up in thought and distraction, but to remain focused and attentive to the present moment, because that awareness and the ability to direct that awareness is going to shape how your brain operates. Now, a little bit of the neuroscience here I thought was interesting. Attention has 3 aspects to it. So there's keeping information in awareness, updating awareness with new information, and seeking or regulating the amount of stimulation. And how you fall across these 3 things is ultimately kind of your neurodiversity, right? And additionally, each of these can be trained. So maybe let's think about it like this. Let's say you are walking down the street and you see someone, okay? And first of all, just keeping your awareness on that person, right? Keeping the information that they're communicating, their gestures, their posture, their motion, their location, in your awareness is one part. And then updating your awareness with new information. So you start to look and you say, oh, I think I know, that's my buddy Jeff, or whatever it is. So that's updating the information. And then the amount of stimulation would be, let's say you start talking to your buddy Jeff, and if you're really interested and the conversation's kind of fun or cool, you stay attuned to it. But if you start to get unstimulated and sort of this is boring, you might start to tune out and seek new, more stimulating interaction from somewhere else. So that's kind of how the attention part of the cognitive system is working at any given moment. So what Dr. Hanson goes on to explain, having established that foundation of mindfulness, that ability to be aware of your inner and outer world and remain present, you start to develop insight there. And the one that he emphasizes in the last couple chapters is starting to have a different perspective on what we may think of as self. And he talks about how the self is actually apparent. And I don't mean apparent like a father or mother. Apparent like apparent, like it's an illusion. It emerges through various causal networks within the person interacting with the environment. And so you have the autobiographical self, all these patterns and stories and belief that constitute your identity. You know, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, I'm a mother, I'm a father, I'm a believer, I'm a this or that, the other thing, right? Those are all stories. Then we have the sort of present self, which is this 1 to 3 second moving snapshot that kind of blurs in terms of the beginning and end. Like the present is not just like one laser slice, right? It's kind of a few seconds that gets blurry on either end. And then this whole thing of like who we are even varies greatly from moment to moment, right? One day I'm feeling more extroverted, more introverted, then I'm feeling good, then I'm feeling bad, right? So a lot of it, if you bring that mindfulness to self-observation, and you start to question like a concrete central self, right? Beyond just the conscious experience of reality, right? That you can see and hear and touch and taste. Beyond that, there's not this real kind of ego self. You start to see through that. And additionally, you have to understand that we're not separate from all of this, right? We have a metabolism. So energy from out there, this entire energetic system of the universe and planet Earth is flowing through us and flowing out of us, right? We are not in the web of life, like we are the web of life. The web of life is woven through us. And so you start to think of these ideas of no self. So if I don't have this ego self, do I have any problems? Do I have any needs? Joseph Campbell said, "Thou art that." We're it. Like there's no, again, when you really look at it from like a physics and ecosystem point of view, and then of course a contemplative point of view, this thing we call self is really this kind of emergent phenomenon that is intermeshed and interrelated this entire web of the planet Earth and universe. I mean, we're literally made of stardust, okay? Carbon, we are carbon-based creatures, is born in the heart of stars. Gold, if you have like a gold watch or gold chain on, okay, that came when two, I think they're called neutron stars, collided with one another and created a massive explosion like the size of a galaxy that actually allowed for the element of gold to be created. Okay, so there's a little out there, I know, but the more we can drop away this kind of fixed and attached view of me and myself and that ego, you start to have a greater sense of wisdom from that place and ultimately a bit better insight and probably happiness too. So to recap all of those big ideas, I'll take us back here from top to bottom. The core idea being that the brain changes based on how it is used. If we intentionally engage in behaviors and practices and contemplations that cultivate these states of love and wisdom and mindfulness and happiness, then we will get, conditioned to experience more of all those things. We see that we're sort of evolved and wired to suffer in many ways, but when we bring our attention to the fact that some of that is inevitable, but all of the additional suffering is optional, and we develop these other practices like virtue, mindfulness, and wisdom, we can start to reduce our own suffering. And then, of course, you have happiness, which comes from regulating your kind of emotional states and developing a capacity for equanimity. You have love, which we have two wolves, right? We have the bad one and the good one. And so leaning into practices that build up our compassion and kindness and empathy. And then finally, wisdom. So cultivating that ability to be where your feet are, to sustain and regulate your awareness, your attention, so that you can develop greater insight and wisdom and ultimately maybe a different view of this thing we call self. That's going to be your foundation. I'll throw in this bonus. I thought it was a little odd, frankly, that this was included at the end of the book, but he included a one-chapter thing from, it's called Nutritional Neurochemistry, that I thought was interesting if you're into like supplements. I'm a little skeptical of them, but again, this book I think is very well researched, respected a lot. So here we go. The suggestions are try a multivitamin with a focus on B12, B6, and folic acid, which support neurotransmitters. Take enough fish oil to consume at least 500 milligrams of DHA and EPA. And that one I actually have done another video about. That is legit, and there have even been studies that find that getting that sufficient amount of DHA and EPA, that's like your omega-3 fatty acids, reduces your incidence of depression and mental illness. So that's a good one. More research is needed, but right now it seems reasonable to take up to 400 IU of vitamin E, at least half of which is gamma tocopherol. Test your iron levels, supplement as needed if you have low iron. You can try 100 milligrams of 5-HTP in the morning or 1,000 milligrams of tryptophan before bed. That supports the neurotransmitter serotonin. Try 500 milligrams of tyrosine in the morning. That supports the neurotransmitter dopamine. And then you should also supplement your acetylcholine with phosphatidylene serine, 200 milligrams, acetyl L-carnitine, 750 milligrams, and huperzine, 100 micrograms. And okay, stay with me if you're just heard all that and you're like, WTF, I don't know what any of that means. Neither do I. Okay, so I'll include the written resource down below, and you can also just take a screenshot of that. And if you put any of those things into like Amazon or Google or whatever, like you will find them. So you don't have to like memorize it all. But hey, I figure in the spirit of sharing as much as possible, I'm not gonna say Jackson Kirchhoff recommends these supplements, but Dr. Rick Hanson and his team throw those in there for supporting optimal neuro health. Okay, that was a long one. Well, I hope you got value out of this video because that sure did take a while to record, but I had fun. Great book. I highly recommend it, especially if you're new to this whole thing of like learning to be happier or meditation or mindfulness or contemplative practice or spirituality even. It's a great way of reconciling some East and West there, which is something I'm very passionate about. On this channel, as always, I share free resources and tools from the Happiness PhD project, which is really my self-directed learning and research into the art and science of happiness. So if you want to support my work or get more involved or even just request or suggest resources, comment down below, reach out to me. All my contact info is available. And until then, I'll see you next time. So here's a video, by the way, that YouTube thinks that you will like. The magical elves that sit behind the YouTube with their calculators and figure out who you are, say to watch that. So I hope you'll enjoy, and I'll see you next time. This has been Jackson Kirchis. Thanks for watching.